r/Nosleep. Posted by u/strange_dangerous. I owned a motel and I may have been renting out rooms to a family of vampires every 4 years for decades. Part 2. I had made the decision to close the motel long before my sister left that photograph. The plans were in motion and it seemed as if nothing was going to stop the sale. That is until he arrived. I hadn't bothered to clean their room after the family had left, too emotionally drained to take on the horrifying task. Instead I retreated back into the house to surround myself with memories and make a meal that my mother used to make for my sister, spaghetti and meatballs with garlic toast. It was comforting. I was cleaning up after dinner when I heard the front door open to the office. The old service bell at the front desk rang loud enough for me to hear. The vacancy sign had long been extinguished and the front door to the office had been locked after the family left. Whoever had rung the bell, they were not welcomed in. I opened the door slowly, with the kitchen knife gripped tightly in my hand. "We're closed," I warned them. The door swung open to an empty room. "I am late," said a voice from the darkest corner of the room. He looked like an animal cowering in the corner, balled up and small. He was more of an unkempt shape than a person, covered in mud and grime. When he stood up, I saw how bad he looked. The dirt reached every crevice as if he were buried in it and only the whites of his eyes stood out from the black coat of mud. He was thin, almost emaciated but still had a strength about him. "I'm sorry, but we're closed," I repeated. "But the sign," he said, pointing up at the "You're always welcome" sign hanging just outside the window. We don't have any clean rooms. I'm sorry. You'll have to find somewhere else," I said, feeling a sudden sense of discomfort. His white eyes met mine with a stare so intense it felt as if he were looking straight through me. "But we already have a room," he said. His voice was soft yet commanding and wholly devoid of emotion. It was then that I recognized him. He was the teenage boy from the family, thought thinner than I remembered. His familiar young features were caked in filth, but I knew it was him. He knew that I knew. "Have they departed?" he asked. I nodded. "Have they left me anything?" he asked, his voice finally cracking. I did not know how to answer. I wasn't sure what he meant. "Have they left any behind?" he said, sounding suddenly desperate. "I don't know," I said, pulling the room keys from their hook. "But you are welcome to check." He took the keys from my hands, his eyes lingering on my arm. It was as if he saw something I did not. "Thank you," he said, and left the office, trailing mud out the door. It wasn't until he was gone that I realized the trail of mud only led outside. That night, I could not sleep. I watched his room from my window and waited for him to leave, but once he closed that door, it seemed as though he disappeared inside. He never even turned on the light. I only left my perch long enough to make coffee, but even then I listened for the creak of that heavy old door. I never did hear it. When day came, I decided to check on him. I knocked many times and announced my intent to enter. He did not respond. The door opened with that familiar old creak and sun once again crept into that dark room. Cigarette smoke still hung heavy in the air and danced in the beams of light. The room key sat idle next to the ashtray. "Hello?" I said. The room itself appeared empty, but I traced his muddy tracks from the door to the table then to the bathroom. He had smoked the old butts left by the others and left nothing behind but burnt filters. The beds, again, were untouched. I knocked gently on the bathroom door. "Are you okay?" I asked. The carpet sloshed under feet, wet from the bathroom overflow. "I'm coming in," I announced, already turning the knob. As the bathroom door turned inward, it pushed aside a layer of sticky wet sludge. It was a mixture of deep red and earthen brown. The putrid sweet smell of decay hit before my eyes could comprehend the horror of what lay before me. The bathtub was half filled with thick old blood and clumps of mud left behind by the boy. His clothes were piled in a damp muddy heap just outside the bath. The floor was sticky with blood and dirt. But still, I stepped inside. The bathtub was full enough with that gruesome sludge that something could still be hiding beneath the surface. As I had done many times before, I reached in and pulled the plug. My hand brushed against something inside and I recoiled. The bubbling gurgle of rotting body fluids oozed down the drain as I waited to see what was hidden inside. Thankfully, it was not the boy. It was the severed leg of a deer that had brushed my hand. The hoof was gnarled, cracked, and the leg itself was nothing more than coarse flesh suspended by tendons still clinging to bone. The muck left behind in the emptied bath was a slurry of torn organ meat and unrendered fat. The remnants of a slaughtered beast. In all my years cleaning, they had never left this kind of evidence. It was always blood, massive amounts of blood and bile, but never anything that couldn't be drained. I assumed then, that this was left by the boy. I did my best to shovel the decaying bits of carcass into a plastic bag and then used old sheets and towels to sop of the puddles of putrid death that remained. I threw all of it into the burn pit out back. I emptied an entire bucket of bleach into the bathroom, just to hide the smell. Exhausted, I fell asleep on the bed, steeped the odors of death and cigarette smoke. I dreamt of my sister. For the first time in as long as I could remember, I could see her face again. When I awoke, it was still the afternoon but the boy had not returned. I was hungry and covered in filth. I showered in the hottest water I could stand, hoping to burn the odor from my skin. Afterwards, I made a sandwich and returned to my perch at the window. I had left the door open to air out the room. I figured that if he had returned, he would close it, but it was open. Night came and I wondered if he had just gone on ahead, searching for the family. I decided that I should close the door and lock it. I had taken his key with me after I had cleaned, so if he wanted back in, he'd have to ask. The moment my foot stepped past the threshold of the room, I saw his white eyes shrouded in the shadows across the room. He was standing just outside the open bathroom. He stood there, motionless and nude but covered in something else. It wasn't the dirt like before, but a deep red crust that cracked dry on his skin. "It is not enough. It has rotted," he said from the shadows. "What are you?" I blurted out. He waited an eternity to answer, just staring at me from across the room. "You know," he said in a weak, hushed voice. "I don't. Is my sister? Is she like you?" I asked. He nodded in a way that seemed he was confused that I was even asking. I stepped backwards out of the room. He stepped forward into the faint moonlight shining across the floor. His body was covered in dry blood and his hair was matted in a thick black tangle. "Please don't hurt me," I stuttered. His eyes grew wide as he approached, before he stopped suddenly. His ghoulish features were suddenly awash in amber headlights. He recoiled and retreated back into the shadows of the room. I turned to see the blinding beams of an old pickup truck as it pulled into our parking lot. I glanced back at the boy, but he was gone. The door to the truck opened and a tall sinewy man with close-cropped hair and thick-rimmed glasses stepped out. He was an older gentleman, gray around the temples, but not elderly by any means. His stature was intimidating and his voice was deep. "Hello," he said, still hidden behind the bright lights of the truck. "Can I help you?" I asked, shielding my eyes. "Sorry." He apologized, then leaned back into the cab and turned off the lights. I felt myself trapped between the monster behind me and the stranger approaching from the front. Without realizing, I had backed myself against the wall. "You work here?" he asked, noting my retreat and stepping back himself. "No vacancies," I shouted, slightly louder than needed. He looked around the lot and squinted at the darkened motel sign. "Right," he said. "We're closed now." "I'm sorry," I said, slightly softer. "I like to stay the night if that is possible. It's been a bit of a drive and we both know there aren't any options anywhere close." "We don't have any rooms available," I said, clearing my throat. "What about that one?" he asked, pointing behind me to the open door. "It isn't clean," I explained. "I don't mind," he said, closing the door to his truck. "I can pay in cash if you fancy it." I shook my head. He leaned one hand on the truck. "None of the rooms are furnished, this one was. But an animal got in and died. I was cleaning it. It wouldn't be sanitary." He stepped forward into the lights of the motel. His face was hard and serious and altogether unsettling. I couldn't help but think back to that writer, about what he said. This man could be one of them, I thought. Here I was with my back to a danger I could not comprehend, while in front of me stood a potential serial killer. He must have read the discomfort on my face. "Okay then. Do you mind if park here for the night, sleep in my truck?" he asked, trying to sound disarming. I thought about it long and hard. "I don't see why not," I said, against my better judgment. He smiled and opened the door to his truck. "Appreciate it," he said, disappointed. I turned back towards the room, but even with the light from the truck I could not see inside. I closed the door and locked it. After that, I locked every door I walked through until I was in my own bedroom. Still uneasy about the two threats that were sleeping only a few hundred feet away, I decided to arm myself. I don't like guns, I've never owned one and I don't care to ever buy one. But my father taught me how to shoot. In fact, he taught me to shoot with my grandfather's old revolver, the same one that was locked in a box beneath my bed. It was my father's lockbox and aside from the gun, I had no idea what I'd find. I had to use a hammer and old screwdriver to break the lock, and after only a few attempts I was able to pop it open. As expected, the gun sat atop a pile of important documents, photos and small mementos that meant something to my father at some point in his life. 6 loose bullets rattled around the steel box. They appeared to be handmade, not purchased, and somehow older than myself. Each one tipped in shiny polished silver. I loaded the revolver and sat it aside. The photos hidden beneath it were not ones I had recognized from my childhood. These were all, for some reason, private to him. The top photograph was of my parents, years before I was born. My aunt that I hadn't seen in years stood next to my mother, smiling and holding the hand of a man in his early 30s. The man looked eerily familiar. He reminded me, maybe too much, of the middle-aged man in the family, though the man in the photo looked too happy to be the expressionless shell I'd known my whole life. The photo beneath that one was of my grandfather standing stone-faced in front of the earliest version of the motel. Beside him were 4 others, who were without a doubt 4 members of the family. None of them, my grandfather included, were smiling. To the right of my grandfather stood the older 2 members of the family, then the middle-aged woman and the teenage girl. The boy and the middle-aged man were missing. The photo was old and faded, but even then it was clear they looked the same as they did only a few days ago. Beneath that I found my sister's birth certificate, old bonds, the deed to the motel, and other uninteresting documents of worth. Below everything, though, was one more thing, a stiff card wrapped in the same paper the family's money was wrapped in, tied with the same twine. I opened it. I unwrapped it to reveal the backside of a photograph, newer than the others, with Chicago, 1974 written in a handwriting that was foreign to me. It was not my mother's or father's. I flipped the photo and felt a cold chill run down my spine. I saw myself, younger than I had ever seen in any family photo. I was dressed in a corduroy overalls and standing in front of an old building. The oddest thing, though, was that I was standing between 2 vaguely familiar adults, holding their hands. All 3 of us were smiling. I wish I could say I was able to place their faces, but I could not. I had to assume they were family friends, but to my knowledge, my parents never had many friends, and those that did would be the ones to visit us. My entire life, my parents made the motel the priority. We had never taken a family trip together outside of a holiday weekend at my aunt's. In fact, as far as I could recall, neither of them had ever mentioned visiting Chicago, and they definitely never said anything about seeing friends there. Who were these people? Where were my parents? Why wasn't my sister with me? My breath grew more rapid with each thought, and I slammed the box shut. I already had too many questions that seemed to be impossible to answer. I was not ready for more. Thankfully, the exhaustion overwhelmed my mind, and I eventually drifted off to sleep. The loaded gun sat safely on the nightstand next to me. I had even pushed a chair beneath the knob of my bedroom door. With the heavy curtains pulled closed, the sun never crept in, and I awoke very late in the morning. Even before coffee, I made my way out to the parking lot. The truck, however, was already gone. I started to feel a tinge of guilt for judging the strange man as I did. That guilt, though, would only deepen as the day progressed. I opened the door to the boys' room. The morning sun flooded in, immediately casting away any dark corners. Immediately, the smell of iron stung my nose. As I stepped up to the bathroom door, my feet once again squished into the soaking wet carpet. The door was unlocked, but as I opened it, I heard the familiar slosh of coagulated blood being pushed aside. I stepped into a familiar, but no less unsettling sight of a tiled white bathroom coated in a crimson blood. I prayed to myself that it was again that of an animal, though even that did not sit well with my conscience. Just to be safe, I decided to clean. I needed to be sure that no trace of the teenage boy was left behind, just in case somebody else came through unexpected. That strange man now made me nervous in an entirely different way. I was so focused that I forgot to make myself coffee. Instead, I went straight to work sopping up the massive amounts of blood. It was only when I was on the floor scrubbing that I noticed some of the blood seep through seams in the tiled floor. Narrow cracks in 3 straight lines forming a box against the wall. I then noticed that the baseboard beneath the sink had been removed, and there were small finger-sized holes in the floor where it met the wall. I crawled across the floor, still slick with blood, and slipped my fingers in. I was able to get underneath and pull up what turned out to be a door or hatch in the floor. As I pulled it open, blood seeped down into the crawlspace beneath the bathroom. A crawlspace that until now, I had no idea even existed. I had no choice but to investigate. It was not large, but deep enough to walk through without crawling. It spread maybe 10 feet in every direction. It was dark, but my phone's flashlight was bright enough to reveal even the furthest corner. Thankfully, the boy was nowhere to be seen. The floor beneath me was soft dirt made muddy from the blood that seeped down. The walls appeared to be crafted from old red brick and mortared in place, unlike any other foundation on the property. Words written in an unfamiliar language were carved into the walls. It smelled of smoke, stale breath and iron. I moved further in to explore the hidden room. Strange crystalline rocks were scattered half-buried around the floor, much like the ones you'd find in the now-closed caverns. The most unsettling aspect, though, was the heaps of soft dirt that were arranged in 7 large piles throughout the room. One for each member of the family. Immediately, the room itself felt heavy with dread. I got out as quickly as possible. I left the crawlspace as I had found it and replaced the baseboard, just in case. I finished cleaning the bathroom and doused everything in bleach, careful to avoid the cracks in the floor. When I returned to the office, there was a message flashing in red on the office phone. I checked and it was from my lawyer, so I returned the call. He informed me that the buyer from the property was expected to stop by. I was told he wanted to see it firsthand, but he was an odd fellow and may not announce his intentions. I could only assume it was the man from last night. He then changed the subject and with a somber tone in his voice he asked if I had heard from anyone in my family. No. I told him. Aside from my aunt, I had no family left. Well then, I hate to be the one to tell you this, but she passed a few weeks ago. He said, clearly uncomfortable. What? What happened? I asked, expecting anything at this point. Well, from what I understand, there was a fire at her property and everything she possessed had perished in it, along with her. Her estate had a little trouble getting in touch with me. He said, stammering over the last part. So the business is gone? I asked, because she, like my parents, owned a small hospitality business. While it wasn't a motel, it was what you would consider a bed and breakfast. Honestly, it was less of a business and more of a hobby for her. Everything. He confirmed. A small part of me was relieved that I wouldn't be burned with that place as well. There was a moment of awkward silence and I could hear him shuffling through papers on his end of the line. Is there anything I need to do? Or are you going to take care of transfers, or estate or whatever? I mean, other than the property, I don't know what I'd want of hers. Hell, even the property, I'm not sure I want to deal with. This place is enough. I chuckled in an awkward moment of levity. He didn't laugh. Instead, I just heard more shuffling. That is the strange thing, she left you nothing. He said, rather bluntly. That's fine with me, I'd rather not deal with it. Well, he said. You still may have to. You see, she left everything to your sister. How old was her will? I asked. She updated it after your parents passed. Oh. But, I guess now would be the time to open the envelope they left for her. Might have some answers. Oh, okay. I'll do that. I said, already worrying about dealing with it all. The conversation shifted onto other aspects of the sale and what I would need to do to prepare for it. All the while, the man from last night was in the back of my mind. In an unexpected turn of events, I was hoping he would return. After the call, I tried to push it all out of my mind. The boy was gone and as far as I knew, the man had left in the morning as well. I was alone again. High in the mountains in this isolated, lonely motel. I wasn't hungry, but I fixed myself a drink and decided to take my lawyer's advice. I retrieved the 3rd letter left by my parents from the cabinet where it had stayed since the day he dropped it off. Carefully I tore open one end. Even folded, I could see through the thin parchment that the message was brief, but it was undeniably written in my mother's handwriting. It said, I fear they are no longer the ones we loved. Burn it down. Burn it all down.